Imagine you're just walking through a bustling ancient marketplace. You're minding your own business, checking out the olive oil or whatever, when suddenly a police officer whips you with a heavy rope soaked in wet red paint.
Which is, a pretty bad way to ruin your toga.
Right. You've just been publicly marked, and
Mm.
you are about to be heavily fined, all because you were, like, loitering instead of showing up to a mandatory city council meeting.
It's an intense image, but that sweaty, aggressive, red-stained reality is actually where the root word for one of the most peaceful, contemplative institutions in modern history was born.
Exactly. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are tracing the fascinating etymological journey of a single, highly disruptive word, and that word is Ekklesia.
And this is a journey that totally upends how we look at history. We've got a really great stack of sources for this one, pulling from classical history texts, philological research, biblical commentaries, and modern theological analyses.
Yeah, our mission today is to look at how a gritty political term from 5th century Athens was eventually adopted to mean church.
And more importantly, we are going to see how a massive linguistic mistranslation completely changed the way modern society views religious communities. This isn't just some dry grammar lesson.
No, not at all.
It's fundamentally a story about how words hold power. It's about how the lines between civic duty and military action blur, and how, a simple translation choice might have fundamentally altered the course of Western institutions.
So to understand how Ekklesia changed the world, we have to start in the dust of ancient Greece. If you break the word down linguistically, it actually seems incredibly spiritual.
Right, on the surface.
Yeah, it's a compound of the Greek preposition ek, meaning out of, and the verb kaleo, meaning to call. So you get to call out.
Which sounds lovely.
It does. You hear that translated today as the called out ones. It sounds like, I don't know, a serene, chosen group of people on a spiritual retreat.
Well, classical philologists actually have a specific term for that kind of assumption. They call it the etymological fallacy.
The etymological fallacy, meaning what exactly?
It's basically the trap of assuming that the literal root parts of a word somehow dictate its actual everyday usage on the street.
Huh.
So in ancient Athens, ecclesia definitely did not mean a passive group of called-out spiritual seekers. It meant a legally summoned assembly of citizens gathered for a specific, usually highly political purpose.
Right. It was the absolute beating heart of Athenian democracy.
Yeah.
This was initiated by early reformers, guys like Solon and Cleisthenes, who wanted the power of the city-state to rest in the hands of the people.
Which meant they had to actually get those people together physically. They met on an open-air hill called the Phoenix, up to like 40 times a year.
And this wasn't just an open mic night for anyone wandering by, right?
Definitely not. It was strictly restricted to adult male citizens who had completed their compulsory military service. And for major decisions, the law required a strict quorum of 6,000 citizens.
6,000 guys. I mean, gathering 6,000 men to just drop their farming or their trades and walk up a steep hill, that wasn't going to happen on the honor system alone.
No, which brings us back to those wet red ropes you mentioned at the start.
Yes, the Scythian slaves.
Exactly. The city employed a police force of about 300 Scythian slaves. Their specific duty was to clear the agora, the central marketplace, on assembly days.
So they would just sweep through the crowds holding these robes dipped in wet red ochre dye, literally herding the loiterers toward the Phoenix.
Yep. Getting tagged by that rope was like getting a literal red mark on your permanent record.
It's like getting publicly shamed and fined for skipping mandatory jury duty.
That's a great comparison. It paints a picture of an institution that was not a casual volunteer club you attended if you felt inspired. It was compulsory civic duty.
And once they were gathered on that hill, the business they conducted was literally life and death. The Ekklesia made executive decisions on funding public works, sending diplomatic envoys, and crucially, declaring war.
They also held the power to banish people. They would use these broken pieces of pottery called ostraka.
Wait, broken pottery.
Yeah, just shards of pottery. They'd use them to cast votes, to exile any citizen they deemed too powerful or a threat to the democracy for 10 years.
And that's where we get the English word ostracized, right?
Exactly. So the takeaway here is that you didn't go to the Ekklesia to sit in a pew and listen to a lecture. You went there to actively govern.
And because the assembly made decisions about going to war, there's a really fascinating overlap in our sources between the people voting and the people doing the fighting.
The boundary between civic governance and military action in ancient Greece was completely fluid. The voters who declared the war were the exact same soldiers who had to pick up a spear and go fight it.
Because there was no separate professional standing army like we have today.
Right. To be a citizen of the city-state was to be a soldier for the city-state. Your socioeconomic class, going all the way back to Solon's reforms, actually determined your military role.
So the wealthiest citizens, who could afford a horse, served as cavalry or generals, the stratugoi.
Yep. And the middle-class farmers equipped themselves with heavy bronze armor to serve as hoplite infantry. Down to the poorest citizens, the thetes, who couldn't afford armor, so they served the city by rowing the massive naval triremes.
The visual of the hoplite phalanx perfectly captures that whole dynamic. You have this incredibly dense, unified wall of soldiers marching forward.
Every man carries a large shield on his left arm, which protects his own body, but crucially, it also protects the unarmored right side of the man standing next to him.
So your survival on the battlefield depended entirely on the collective discipline of the group.
Exactly. That military formation perfectly mirrored the democratic equality and collective discipline of the Ekklesia itself. You couldn't have one heroic aristocrat breaking ranks to show off. The whole system relied on the active, synchronized participation of the entire body.
And because the army was literally just the citizen body in armor, the Ecclesia could go on the march. The physical hill of the phoenix wasn't the magic ingredient. The people were.
Right. We see this brilliantly illustrated in Xenophon's Anabasis.
I love this story.
It's incredible. It's a historical account from around 400 BC detailing the plight of the 10,000, which was this massive army of Greek mercenaries who marched deep into the heart of the Persian Empire.
And through a treacherous double cross, their generals are invited to a peace conference and brutally murdered.
So you have 10,000 armed Greeks stranded in hostile Mesopotamian territory, thousands of miles from the coast, completely surrounded with absolutely no leadership structure.
The natural response there is mass panic and immediate surrender.
But instead, they fall back on their deepest civic programming. They form a mobile ecclesia right there in the dirt.
They convene formal, democratic assemblies in the middle of a war zone.
Yeah. They debated their retreat routes, they held trials for officers accused of misconduct, and they democratically elected new commanders to lead them, including Xenophon himself.
Our sources show the Macedonian military assemblies functioned exactly the same way later on, acting as an ecclesia to judge treason and ratify kings on campaign.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. Think about the shock of that to modern sensibilities. It would be like, I don't know, a modern military unit suddenly unionizing or forming a working parliament right in the middle of a battlefield.
It sounds absurd to us today, but to the ancient Greeks, it highlighted a profound foundational belief. The power of governance, the authority of law and order, it traveled with the people. It wasn't tied to a specific piece of geography in Athens. The ecclesia was a survival mechanism as much as a political one.
Okay, so that concept of mobile, localized governance is the vital bridge to understanding what happens a few centuries later during the Roman Empire.
This is the massive shift.
Right. This is the moment this gritty, political, military term enters the religious lexicon in a way that just changes history. When Jesus of Nazareth is establishing the foundation of his movement, he declares, "On this rock I will build my ecclesia."
And choosing that specific word feels like a very deliberate provocation. I mean, he had so many safer options.
Yeah, the word synagogue was readily available and widely used. That specifically meant a religious gathering.
Or he could have used theos, which described a private religious club or association.
Or even the temple, the ultimate static building of worship. Passing all of those over to use a loaded civic and military term suggests he was, well, picking a fight with the status quo.
To really grasp the weight of that choice, we have to look at two distinct cultural contexts operating at the exact same time.
Okay, lay them out for us.
First, there is the Septuagint. This was the widely used Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. The translators of the Septuagint consistently use the word ekklesia to translate the Hebrew word kohal.
And the Quails was the Grand Assembly of Israel.
Exactly. But in the historical context of the wilderness wanderings, that assembly was not a passive congregation. It functioned as a highly structured, mobilized military camp marching under divine command.
Oh, wow. So to a Jewish audience in the first century, hearing ecclesia carried the heavy historical memory of a mobilized nation on the move.
Precisely. And then you have the Roman context.
Right, because the Romans were brilliant at assimilating Greek tools to run their empire.
Right, and they adapted the ecclesia model via an institution called the conventus. This was a legal gathering of Roman citizens anywhere in the empire.
So if you were a Roman citizen living in a conquered province like Philippi or Corinth, you were a minority surrounded by foreign customs.
But when a group of Roman citizens convened together in a conventus, they acted as a literal microcosm of Rome. They brought the emperor's legal power and the cultural atmosphere of Rome directly into their midst.
It functions exactly like a modern embassy.
That is the perfect analogy.
Because if you walk into a foreign embassy in your city today, the moment you step through those doors, you are legally standing on the soil of that foreign kingdom. It operates with full legal authority inside the borders of a different empire.
Yes. So when Jesus says, "Where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I among them," he is tapping directly into that Roman administrative reality. He's essentially describing an embassy.
That framework completely transforms his famous follow-up statement, doesn't it? The claim that the gates of Hades will not prevail against his ecclesia.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of modern interpretations treat that as a comforting promise of protection, as if the church is a fortress that evil cannot break into. But think about it. Gates are defensive structures.
Right, they sit completely still. You don't get attacked by a gate.
Exactly. You only interact with a gate if you are the one doing the attacking.
You have to be storming the gates.
By utilizing a military and political term, the early Christians were making a highly provocative, almost seditious claim to the Roman authorities. They weren't presenting themselves as a passive religious sect retreating behind walls. They were declaring themselves an invading counter-government on the offensive.
Wow.
Yeah, they believed they were actively storming the defensive gates of the Empire of Death, bringing the governance of their king into foreign territory.
Okay, so if the early Christians were claiming to be an active, mobilized counter-government on the offensive, it begs a massive historical question.
How did we get to the word church?
Exactly. If ecclesia means an active, governing assembly of citizens and soldiers, how in the world did we end up sitting quietly in wooden pews on a Sunday morning under the banner of church?
It is honestly one of the most consequential linguistic detours in human history, because the English word church is entirely disconnected from the etymological root of ecclesia. They share absolutely zero linguistic DNA.
So where did church even come from, and how did it hijack the translation?
The word church derives from an entirely different Greek word, kuriakon.
Kuriakon, what does that mean?
It simply means belonging to the Lord, and over time it became a shorthand for the Lord's house.
Okay, so a building.
Yes. In the early centuries, the Christian ecclesia met in living rooms and public spaces. But after Christianity was legalized and became the official state religion of the Roman Empire, emperors began funding the construction of massive, grand basilicas.
So the physical location of the gathering suddenly became the most prominent feature.
Exactly. The focus shifted away from the dynamic assembly of people and onto the static architecture. The word for the physical real estate literally swallowed the word for the movement.
That is wild.
So the Greek word kuriakon migrated into the Germanic languages as kirch. From there, it traveled to Scotland as kirk, and eventually evolved into the modern English word church.
And then the English Bible translators systematically used this building-centric word, church, to translate ecclesia.
Yep. They substituted a dynamic word about a mobile, governing assembly for a static word about a piece of property.
The irony there is just staggering. I mean, Jesus seemingly goes out of his way to avoid using words associated with static buildings,
Yeah.
bypassing the temple to choose a word meaning a mobile governing body. And centuries later, the English language just swaps his chosen word for one that literally means a physical building.
The psychological impact of that linguistic shift is incalculable. It fundamentally transformed society's concept of the institution itself.
It shifted it from a they or a we to an it.
Exactly. From an active people operating out in society 24 hours a day to a static destination you go to on Sunday. It domesticated a term that was originally designed to be a disruptive force.
Looking at the source material, it's fascinating to observe this from a purely sociological standpoint today, because that original disruptive governmental meaning of the word is making a massive, highly visible comeback.
It really is, and it is actively shaping modern religious and political movements right now.
Yeah, and just as a reminder to you listening, our goal here isn't to take sides or endorse these viewpoints, but just to impartially report on what our sources are analyzing.
Right. So, over the last few decades, a wide spectrum of movements, ranging from decentralized charismatic house church networks to more politically focused groups, often categorized as dominionists or Christian nationalists, they have been diving deeply into this exact etymology.
They're attempting to reclaim the civic, governmental, and military aspects of the word ecclesia. For those unfamiliar with the terminology, dominionism is a theological framework emphasizing that believers are called to govern or exercise stewardship over earthly society, not just wait for an afterlife.
Hmm.
How are these modern groups actually applying this history practically?
While many interpret the history as a literal mandate to exercise spiritual authority and to occupy culture, the defining metaphor you hear frequently in these circles is that the church was never meant to be a cruise ship, but rather a battleship.
Oh, that metaphor does a lot of heavy lifting. On a cruise ship, the passengers are just consumers. You pay a fee to be entertained and catered to by a professional crew.
Right, but on a battleship.
There is absolutely no passengers. Every single person on board, from the cook to the navigator, has a combative station and a specific role necessary for the survival of the ship.
That active, mobilized mindset is the engine behind a modern strategy known as the Seven Mountains of Influence.
7 mountains of influence. What are the mountains?
It's a framework suggesting that if the Ekklesia is truly a governing body, its influence shouldn't be restricted to a religious building on Sunday. Believers should seek spiritual dominion over the 7 primary spheres of society: religion, family, education, government, media, arts and entertainment, and business.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that.
Yeah.
Are these modern groups advocating for a literal return to the Athenian model of voting on city policies, or is this a purely spiritual framework to influence modern culture?
It actually creates a massive and very tense spectrum.
Yeah.
Taking the business mountain might mean launching companies that operate on strict biblical ethics or engaging in spiritual warfare, which is targeted prayer to pull down spiritual strongholds of corruption. Taking the arts mountain means producing high-quality films to shape the moral imagination of the culture.
Okay, so spiritual influence and ethical leadership.
For the vast majority, yes. But at the edges of the movement, particularly within Christian nationalism, the line between spiritual governance and literal institutional political control gets incredibly blurry.
Just like the ancient Greeks, where the voters were the soldiers.
Exactly. For some, reclaiming the ecclesia means actively working to ensure that civil laws, school boards, and national policies enforce a specific theological worldview.
That tension highlights a profound historical paradox. The early Christians in the Roman Empire utilized the term ecclesia to represent a heavenly citizenship. They were boldly claiming a different king while enduring intense state persecution and martyrdom.
They possessed zero institutional political power.
None. And today, you have vastly different factions pointing to the exact same etymological history to justify wildly different cultural actions.
Right. One group uses the concept of the mobile organic assembly to abandon massive buildings altogether, forming intimate house churches focused purely on grassroots community. Another group uses the exact same history to fuel broad, aggressive socio-political activism aimed at seizing earthly power.
It really all comes back to the foundation. Words build worlds. And finally, we explored how a linguistic swap to the building-centric word church created a historical disconnect that is currently fueling intense debates across modern culture. As we wrap up today's deep dive, I want you to reflect on the institutions that you belong to in your own life. It doesn't have to be a religious organization. It could be your workplace, a university, a neighborhood association, or a volunteer group. Think about the places where you work, learn, or gather. If those institutions were truly defined by the people in them, if they required the active, engaged battleship responsibility of every single member to function, rather than just relying on the buildings that house them or the professional managers that run them, how would that fundamentally change your daily responsibility to that group? If the true power of your organization wasn't in the corporate headquarters, but in the people walking the streets carrying the culture with them, what would you do differently tomorrow morning? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.